the lunch talk seminar series. And I see a lot of faces that I recognize and the new ones welcome and come back. But it's really great to have you here today. And a great pleasure for me to introduce the speaker today, Professor Anna Bigelow. Professor Bigelow's research is multidisciplinary and deeply innovative and transformative. Just as varied and transformational is her work, what she does on campus here. And I just named that in addition to being a professor in the Religious Studies Department, she also is the director, the faculty director of the Center for South Asia and a course at the faculty. And it has been just very great for us, etc., to have her join us since she arrived at Stanford. Professor Bigelow is a specialist of Islamic studies and the religions of South Asia and the Middle East. She focuses in her work on Muslim devotional life, especially on sacred spaces and ritual practices, with a distinct interest in materiality and the lived embodied experience. Her first book is called Sharing the Sacred, Practicing Pluralism in Muslim North India. And she also just now in 2021 came out a volume that she edited called Islam Through Art. At Vesta, she's been directing the Mapping Shared Sacred Sites project that you'll hear more about today. And I just want to point out that this is a project for which active and transformational connections are really key. It is, to begin with, the project is an internationally collaborative project, and the other PIs, the co-PIs of Professor Bigelow are based both in France and in other places in the US. And it's also a project that uses the digital to recover stories of connections, of cohabitations and hospitality and tolerance in religious spaces. They really are strikingly and so important to recover and counter narrative to the better known stories of strife and antagonism that we often hear about. So we know further wait and give Anna the audio, and thanks for coming and joining us today.
And I want to introduce one of my collaborators and colleagues who, when we started this project, was just across the bay at Berkeley, and has since fled for the East Coast. And Karen Barkey, who is a historian and sociologist, and she is now at Bard College. And she and I, together with two colleagues at CNRS, Manuel Penico and Dionigi Albera, are sort of the core research team here. And we have been working on projects for a while. And so Karen has done amazing work on the Ottoman context in particular, and looking at the histories of understanding of the place of religious minorities within imperial formations, and has also taken a turn for the ethnographic away from the historical in recent years. So Karen, do you want to say a little bit about yourself and how you came to this project, and then we can do our little story.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you everyone at CESTA and collaborators at CESTA for inviting us to present this. This is an incredibly exciting project, and I got to this project actually part through my scholarly work and part through my childhood experience, because I grew up in Istanbul, and I saw in many ways I experienced the shared places as I was growing up, but did not fully understand what they were and how they functioned and all of that. And when I finished my book, which was about the Ottoman Empire especially, and how the empire managed diversity on the ground, This was a book that was very much from the top-down version of management of diversity. I started asking myself questions about the coexistence of communities themselves. How did they coexist? Where did they encounter each other? In markets, in sacred places, at the court, you know. So I started writing first about legal pluralism, but then I realized with a colleague actually at Columbia, I was teaching at Columbia then, I move around a lot, but at Columbia, Elazar Barkan, who was working on sites that were conflictual in Jerusalem or in Palestine, Israel. And he and I started talking, and we started this project that ended up in this book called Choreographies of Shared Sacred Sites. Here you can see, and you'll see that the image is the image that we used in the website as well. And after that, I started this website at Columbia and then brought it to Berkeley. And the moment Anna Bigelow came to Stanford, I said, Anna, we have to do this together. And I pulled her in, and we've been working together since then. And we have these two French collaborators. So we're really a good international team working on many different sites and hoping to really, as the introducer said, to provide an alternative narrative of religious existence and coexistence and move away from the simple journalistic or policy, narrative of eternal conflict. So that was the project's main goal. Anna, I leave it to you to start from there.
Great, thank you, Karen. So let's see if I can go back to where I was before. So this group, we've sort of worked for a long time together, meetings that go back for 15 years at least, that have brought us together across the regions and looking to try to expand beyond the regions that we've studied up till now. We have a research team that with a graduate research assistant, Jem Jebbia from my department, and also a CESTA intern, Shannon Gifford, who is a history major, and together we are all working on all of this. And so we have our little team here. You can see little blurbs about the team and about our current research associates and all of the work that they've been doing, building on a bunch of past people. The site has gone through a lot of iterations, and the part that we've been trying to work on the most is to try to build a coherent view, and that is something that has been a challenge just in web design. If any of you are adept in how to create coherence across a web platform, that is something that we are constantly struggling with. So you can see we're trying to integrate research by 4 different scholars at least, and we have a directory and network of other scholars that is also part of this. We're developing a bibliography that is based on many of our works and is going to eventually be more searchable. We are building a news database that has references to media stories about shared sacred spaces. All of them, as Karen was saying, is by way of trying to complicate the stories that are often told about these spaces, to create not only sort of a documentary database that shows these kinds of spaces exist in lots of different ways all over the world, that they're not inherently conflictual. In many cases, they're spaces of proactive, pro-social engagement between people at different points and times in their lives. So we're trying to figure out a whole host of ways to make that available to a wide audience. It's always a good question to ask about audience. One of the things that we struggle with a lot is sort of trying to balance between our sort of scholarly niche research approaches, and then also trying to make information available to a wider public or potentially useful in forms that would be helpful for teaching in particular. And so we have a few future expansions there, but for what we have right now, we can see that the site features have a focus on our maps. We're working on story maps as well as on a global map. We're trying to, this is where we've been struggling the most, is with the global map dimension. And that's something that I'd be delighted to get feedback from people about some of the challenges we've faced there, and trying to think of ways to move forward with that. The bibliography database, our directory of scholars. There's also been a number of exhibits that have appeared in museums around the world, from Ankara to Marseille to the New York Public Library, where a few years ago, Karen and Dionigi and Manuel all curated together an exhibition of materials from the public library, and that was at several other spaces around New York as well, including an exhibition at the New School and at oh, Karen, why am I forgetting? What's the name of that other library?
At the Morgan Library and Museum, but also at CUNY graduate space.
Yeah. So sorry, not at New School, at CUNY.
Yeah.
So, you know, again, just sort of trying to create a multi-layered experience that is both in person, that is online, that creates some tools that are available to a host of people. We are also have started in the areas where our work is most centered, or where it overlaps the most. Most of my research is actually in India, but I have some research sites that I'm interested in Turkey. And my work has focused on sort of more ethnographic dimensions of how people from multiple religious traditions interact around shared sacred sites, and what are the ways in which the experiences within these sites and the objects that are manipulated and moved through these sites are activated in people's daily lives outside of the spaces. So that's something that I've been tracking mostly in India and to a degree in Turkey. And so we wanted our site to offer people for whom just even the phenomenon that people of multiple religions could ever be in the same space without it turning into another conflicted situation, or simply sort of like a parallel play kind of mode of people go and do their utilitarian things and walk away. Our work really demonstrates in so many ways how central spaces like this are to conceptions of collectivities and communities, and are part of people's self-imaginings around what it means to be a citizen of any particular place. So I think maybe one of the easiest ways for us to start with this is to look at some of our story maps and just sort of show you a little bit about what we're trying to do and get some feedback. This site is, though it's public, we haven't really been pushing it out or promoting it in any way, because we're very much working on it. So we'd be really glad to hear some feedback from anybody who is interested in these spaces, or has suggestions for ways to make this more manageable. So our work is, most of the sites we've done are in the Mediterranean up till now, because that's the region where our work coincides. And so we've looked, the story maps we've done to date relate to the House of Mary in Ephesus. The India one is very much under construction right now, so we'll skip that. The Church of Mary in Vefa, which is also known as the First Day of the Month Church, which we'll talk about in a minute. A synagogue in Crete, a synagogue in Djerba in Tunisia, and another church in Turkey. All of these places are places that are populated by multiple religious actors. And so what we want to try to capture in our story maps are ways in which these sites are engaged by multiple communities to create a visual resource that of images that are taken by ourselves or by collaborators that we've worked with over the years, to make them more accessible, and to give people an imaginary of what it would mean to walk through these spaces. We have additional potential dimensions that we want to conceptualize in the future, but right now I think we'll just start by walking you through one of our example story maps, and then we can shift to talk about some of our global map challenges. So Karen, this is over to you to start.
Yes. So actually the Church of Mary in the Vefa neighborhood in Istanbul is a church that both Anna and I have worked at independently from each other. We went there at different times. We talked to different people. So, but we both came back with both stories and knowledge of the practices, as well as the objects that are being used in this place. And Anna came back with many more beautiful pictures than I did. So a lot of the pictures that you're gonna see are part of Anna's collection. Anna, I cannot move the picture, so
Oh, I'll have to do it, yeah.
yeah, you'll have to do it. I just realized that.
Sorry. Yeah, many of these pictures were taken by a dear friend who recently passed away, Mehmet Okutan. So this picture including, so he's a professional photographer. And a lot of the images we took in days at the space that were not sort of festival days, as it were. The first day of the month is the day that the place is visited. And so then it's very crowded, but other days it's more of a sort of neighborhood spot that people come and visit and hang out, and the priest reads the newspaper.
Yeah.
All right.
So you'll have an image of the church right here, and people waiting on the first of the month. So this church is really famous for the pilgrimage that people from Istanbul and even some other places come to do every first of the month. It is the pilgrimage day, and this is the time when Muslims and Christians really join together in the pilgrimage. And it is also open actually on Tuesdays and Thursdays for individuals to come and pray and make a wish. It is in the district, it is in Istanbul, and in the district of, you'll see next, of Unkapanı. So we have this way in which we start with a larger map and then we slowly move in. It's very close to the Golden Horn, which is where supposedly Sultan Mehmet the Conqueror put the chain that stopped the boats from Byzantine Empire to fight back. But it is named after, the neighborhood is named after a famous Turkish poet, a Sufi poet actually, Şeyh Abülvefa. In this neighborhood, you have actually very significant other Byzantine, Roman, and Ottoman places, and I will come back to it in a minute, because it's after the space. So if you show us the space, Anna, we can I will explain.
Yeah.
I don't need the text, but maybe people need the text. I want just the pictures. So if you see here, this is the entrance into the garden of the church. And usually on the first of the month, there are lots of sellers who sell little objects to make wishes with. And Anna will talk about that later. This is the garden of the church when there's no one there, but usually on the first of the month, it is full. And it is also a place of communal exchanges, of conversation, of support of people, etc. Here you have the main nave of the church, and on the left you will see where the priest actually stands. And in a busy day of pilgrimage, there is a long line of people who wait there to be blessed by the priest, both Muslim women and men, as well as Christians, wait in line to be blessed by the priest. And they also pray in this space. Below, you will have the second level of the church, which is really very important for the ayazma, for the fountain, for the water that you can get at this place. It is supposed to be holy water, and it helps in health, etc. Now, this ayazma concept is very important because throughout Istanbul, and especially during the Byzantine times, there were lots of water ways and passageways that had been that had water, and those got buried over time. When one of them would get discovered, people got very excited that this was religious holy water, and they built a church on top of the space. Many churches, Byzantine churches, have actually these ayazmas. The history of this church is also interesting because actually there are always multiple stories, about the construction of the space. Some say that it was constructed in the 5th century, by a patrician. Others say that no, this was a burial space for the Palaiologos family dynasty of Byzantine rulers, and that it was destroyed during the Ottoman conquest in 1453. So there are multiple ways in which the story is told. But what we know really is that this space was bought by a Christian family, and the reason it was bought by this Christian family is that their daughter had a dream and saw water and holy water. So the area was excavated and then a church built. The church went through many iterations. The most important one is that during the events of 1955, which were part of the Turkification, the homogenization of the country after the early Republican period, there were actually quite violent violence in the streets against Greeks, Armenians, and Jews who had their shops and their churches destroyed in that time period. They're called 6-7 September events in Turkey. And today, it is really a well-known little church that is shared by multiple religions. So just to give you a sense that this was an important space, there was a beautiful church, the Church of the Holy Apostles, that was built in the Byzantine times, that was taken immediately after Fatih Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror took Istanbul, and he liked that church a lot, and he wanted to build a mosque to the space, on the space of that church. So the church was turned into a mosque, and so additions were made to make it into a mosque. The other place that was taken and was turned into a mosque and is now being reconsidered, or had been reconsidered as a Christian space at one point, was the monastery of Christ Pantocrator, one of my favorite places in Istanbul. It was a 12th century Byzantine monastery with a school and a hospital, etc. And then it became a madrasa and a mosque after the conquest of Istanbul. So these give you a sense that this area was, strewn with little churches, and that some of them became mosques, but not all. Quite a few were left to be churches. And practices.
Yeah. So just briefly, so these are all here as visitors will often attend all of these places. And so just sort of from the sort of technological perspective and thinking this through a SESTA lens, we are trying to engage sort of multiple different modes of display of some of our materials. So here we have a gallery that looks at some of the religious practices that are involved here. Challenges with story maps are always to try to make the text legible in and around the materials. I'm sure some of you have run across that, where we're trying to demonstrate some of the ways in which people engage in the space, some of the different practices that are shared, things that are distinct, to sort of give as much as possible an experience of the site to those who visit. We'll talk more about objects in a minute, but here's clearly a place where we need to relocate our text. So good to know. Candles, of course, are fairly ubiquitous practices where people take the keys that are sort of the particular object of the site and use them to unlock the icons, as it were, that are in cases. You know, the keys obviously don't unlock anything literal, but are very powerful unlocking of one's the intentions of one's prayers. Moving through the lower level and getting to the iasma, the spring and the holy water, and taking water, which is very common to do here. Consulting with the priest, which is actually done by people of all religions, and including in some cases laying on of hands and blessings and the sign of the cross. Muslims also will occasionally engage in the sign of the cross with their keys over the icons, simply because that's the correct practice in this place and people would understand it. And then very importantly for my work and Karen's is this idea that people engage with each other here as much as they are engaging with the sacred spaces. And so when your wish is filled, then people will often return and visit with one another. We're developing a gallery that discusses some of the objects more particularly to create a sense of the material culture of the site that is significant. There's a short video that Karen has taken that talks about the pilgrimage, and then on each of these sites, we're going to include additional resources. Eventually, some of those additional resources will include some curricular materials and things that people could use to, like lesson plans, ways that this might be engaged in a classroom, you know, K-12 or college. And so sort of at different levels of interest, things you could read about Vefa in additional places, resources that are in our bibliography that people could find, etc. So all of this is getting sort of interlinked, as it were. So this sort of story map, which gives a sort of a richer tale of a particular site, is meant to be complementing our other project, which is happening in a couple different ways right now. So we have been really challenged with trying to work around the potential ways of doing global mapping and what is involved in not only, you know, the politics and the problems and challenges of geotagging of places around the world, many of which, when you drill down, aren't where they say they are once you get in there, as I'm sure some of you have also found. But so we are currently playing with both a sort of really basic Google My Map model and for some ArcGIS models. We started out working, and I can sort of start with our biggest problems. So this is very much not completed, but we started out trying to think through how can we represent the diversity and complexity of these spaces where you have multiple overlapping religions, multiple conditions of sharing, multiple histories that may mean that this is changing over time, and representing change over time. And all of these indices was starting to result in a spreadsheet that was about 105 sheets long, and we were realizing that on the one hand, what we want to be able to the map to do is also requiring us to make some decisions about these spaces that are not actually reflecting what the spaces constitute. And so there simply aren't yes/no answers to things like Muslim or Christian. You know, it becomes extremely, so how far do we want to drill down? So we started with trying to make maps where you could tag out particular religions that would be involved. but then this doesn't necessarily tell you which other religions that they're sharing with, and trying to narrow that down was one problem. We tried with color coding all of the different sites with multiple colors to represent the multiplicities. That also seems, obviously, you can have a legends here, but it was, becoming more complex and less manageable. We tried different types of sites. We tried thinking about different types of figures that were involved, different modes of sharing, different regions of focus. So all of these kinds of approaches had sort of seemed like they were bringing a piece, but were also flattening as much as it was revealing. And so that brings us back to the question of like, then who is this for, and what are we ultimately hoping we can do with it? So I need to move this around. So we have the option of a sort of very basic GIS map where we could have simple pop-ups. We can include pictures and text, and have a short description of different sites so people can search this way. This is not too distinct from the kinds of things that a basic Google My Map would also contain, where we've here included a bunch of different sites, and the ones for which we have story maps are simply marked with a different color. But we can find, zoom in, find some basic information on all of these sites. But the problem is the searching is very rudimentary, and all you have are options. I can't search Jewish Muslim sites, because all I will get is any site that says Jewish and any site that says Muslim, and then it'll search the rest of the web. So the Google My Maps is very unfriendly as far as we can tell so far. If anybody's had other experiences, we'd be delighted. That kind of database processing is possible with ArcGIS, but it again is going to requires an incredibly complex spreadsheet sort of and database to make it actually usable. So it comes down to, what do we want people to be able to do with this, and what would people likely want it to be able to do? What would you come here? And this is sort of where we are trying to sort of torn between simplifying and making it very basic and widely available, or we're sort of at the point where we would have to essentially hire somebody to build our own global map that would be probably very expensive. So we're sort of, this is just to sort of show you some of the challenges of trying to explain complicated ideas with a host of different materials. So we're building, and we're working on creating a whole host of other sources. We've talked also about building in some short web seminars with, say 20 minutes to half an hour sort of talks with other scholars working on shared sacred spaces that would be teaching tools accessible through this. We are talking about having it be possible for people who work in shared sacred sites to submit story maps of their own that would reflects their experiences. Most of our story maps are currently using the same essential structure, and I'd be delighted to hear whether that seems like it's working for you all as a way to offer a window on the spaces like this and how they function. So they all have sort of more or less the same core structure, but anybody could theoretically do this. Students could be, one could do a study abroad program that would bring people to these sites. And so, yeah, what else did we want to talk about? Karen, what else did we want to talk about?
I think our major really concern and issue was the mapping side of this, and whether these the maps could be integrated. No, we wanted feedback on the story maps and how we would continue with embedding material into this, but also really, I think most importantly, the complications of the larger mapping process is what we would love to hear some some feedback on.
Yeah. And here's Jim, who's also been helping with our website. I mentioned you at the beginning.
Thank you.
So Jim has been struggling through the features of our website to try to make some of this coherent and is working on some of that. I don't know if you want to say anything about what you've done.
I mean, I think interesting is like just the relationship between the website and housing, sort of the research side of things. There's some wonderful research around shared sacred sites and what that means and kind of how different scholars define religion and space. And I think just thinking about the relationship between that and the mapping side of things, which, you know, is housed on our website, but also like, or not housed, is linked to our website, but is housed in like story maps and the global map, and just kind of making these tools more user-friendly, and also like building the relationship between them is my question and task, I think.
And Shannon's main questions are really about the sustainability and searchability issues for the global map and how that has become problematic. So I guess we'd be happy to talk about any of the particular features and get feedback. We can talk in greater detail about the actual research, which is of course much more complicated than we've been able to represent here. But as we were encouraged to bring a work in progress, here is our work in progress, which is working on a lot of fronts and with a lot of different moving parts, as it were. So great.
I see that. So maybe I just have to, so you could call this the global map.
Eventually.
Because you have already sites, but then you said that you focus so far on the Mediterranean. I wonder what's the global is used so much these days, but now really it looks like you really want to work map. So I just wonder if you can comment on.
So I don't know if I can find it right now, but we have a preliminary map of over 200 sites that one of our teammates has worked on, and it is mostly Mediterranean, India, and Africa at this stage. So though theoretically, yes, we would like it to be truly global, it'll never be truly comprehensive, obviously, because for these places are quite literally almost everywhere, and we're not going to put everything that exists on the planet onto this site. But we are just sort of doing our test cases with a smaller set of data points in order to try to mock up the capacities of each of these different projects. So, I mean, as you probably know, it's incredibly time consuming to build each of these and to sort of see the ways in which it's failing to do what we want it to do. And also the way, I think we still have a hope possibly that, and Karen, you can correct me or jump in here, that there might be some features of these global maps that reveal things and patterns perhaps that we might not have been able to observe. We have some colleagues working in Italy on a set of projects where they're doing more sort of technical mapping of particular sites and creating some more architecturally specific renderings of some of the sites that they're looking at. And so that's obviously another way to go that involves a lot of high-tech cameras and other sorts of things. And so we've sort of moved in the direction of trying to create a wider accessibility and potential for pedagogy, but also potentially for journalists or others who are interested in telling more complicated stories than what typically gets told here. So yes, global, but
I just thought of that, and then I let the others because remember when you first talked to me about the project, I had that immediately in mind that I think it's a Mellon funded called the Global History of Architecture, something where they do have a very fancy looking globe that also rotates and so, but, and then which looks great. But then I know that, for example, the last times I thought, or we put some data from even just like everybody was being assessed and put it on the map and the global map, and we were all excited. But then what we ended up with is like that there are so many empty parts, and so maybe the global, like, I mean, even if it's a global reach in our mind, but the map can be problematic. And so, but that would just, I wonder what would happen, but it's now whether.
Yeah, maps can be incredibly problematic. 100%. Yeah. Sarah, no.
I have a question and two suggestions. First, thank you for sharing this work. I'm not a tech person and I admire those who do it or hire those who do it better.
I'm not.
So thank you to the team. My question is, when you had the list of shared sacred sites, I was wondering why the Hagia Sophia wasn't there and if that was an intentional choice. And maybe it was somewhere and I didn't see it. I haven't played around on the website, but I'm wondering, are you choosing to highlight less internationally well-known shared sacred sites that have both Muslim and Christian and maybe even Judaic influences, and as part of this trying to amplify those? So that's the question. The two suggestions were, one, when you had the really nice, almost visitor experience module where you show people different parts, I think it'd be great to have a small map on the side that shows you where you are. So maybe a map that looks like the entire building or the entire church, and then it would say, now you're on the right side, now you're on the left, now you've gone down the stairs, because I think that would help people know where they're going in relation to the exit, to the bathrooms, to help them feel like they're really there. And the other suggestion,
Bathrooms are always a problem in these places.
it's outside.
But, I'm sorry.
And the final suggestion, you mentioned maybe taking students or thinking about collaborative ways to build the bibliographies. I'm wondering if this could be a study abroad experience for students here through BOSP and Students Go, and then maybe they help you with those bibliographies or trying to think about how to maximize on students being familiar with some of this hardware, software, more than at least professors are. I know that I've had success having students create story maps, even though I still don't really know how story maps works. They were able to do things that I didn't even know could be done. I know Nicole did ArcGIS work with maps on the database protocol. I don't even know the right word, but she did magic that I do not know how to do. And so I'm wondering if maybe having students get a grade for it or tying it into your own curriculum might help a bit.
Thank you for all of that. And we have not excluded sites that are in contestation at all. And Hagia Sophia is one of the ones that we probably will build next, again, because it's something that several of us have worked on. And I've written on as well, the complicated situations there. But part of the goal is the project will be representative of the complexity, that there isn't, and so there is a little bit of a corrective push at the outset to try to focus on sites that complicate our narratives of, inevitable incoherence of spaces where people encounter each other volitionally around shared religious spaces that are also embedded within very complicated political dynamics around minorities, majorities, and states with varying degrees of interest in representing these spaces in certain ways. And so, all of our research gets into those kinds of complications, and a lot of these kinds of materials we're finding there's often that's a challenge to try to continue to maintain the complexity while also making it maximally again, available to wider thing. We've talked to, in fact, this is something we need to revisit, Karen. We've talked to a couple architects in Turkey who would help us do some of the schematic drawings.
Yes.
Because most of these places don't have, the more wayside, we could get a schematic of the Hagia Sophia quite easily, right? But not, so this church doesn't have, the one we were showing you all doesn't have a lot, something like that, but it's also not a very complicated building. And we don't need it to be like technically precise. We need it to be, something like exactly what you're suggesting, something that would be generally accessible. So that's something that we really do want to follow up on. So yay, I'm glad you like that too.
Yeah.
And WASP, sure, as we all know, time is really the problem in life. that not money. So that's like when to do those things, but doing something like that to bring students. Karen actually can't go to Turkey anymore, so we'd have to work in some other places, but could bring students to other sites.
Well, we're also doing that actually. In the spring, we're going to Volos in Greece, which has a Sufi Bektashi shrine where Christians and Muslims share. And we are going to take a few students to the space and have them work with us on the map, the story map, and the photography and all of that. So on a small scale, we're doing it, but it's hard to actually do this for all of the sites that we are interested in. I think what we need to do, Anna, and we've talked about this, is also engage other scholars, have them participate in the project and make a story map of a place that they have worked on, that they have beautiful photography from, etc. And all of that will help us in the long run get another level of, richness to this, which just if it's just our sites, it won't be enough. So all of that is in a sense in the works, but it requires time and funds and a lot more, so yes.
Thanks, Sarah.
So I have a bit of a horrible question. So first I want to say how much I love your work and Karen's work. I'm coming from heritage studies that has really capitalized on the idea that heritage and religion is a topic of examining conflict, right? So I think that the Sharing Sacred Spaces initiative is the antidote that heritage studies has been needing all this time, and I've told you this many times. So on that line, when we think about this issue of conflict in sites of heritage of religion, I've argued that it's the agencies and narratives that are built around heritage making that are disrupting the choreographies of sharing, right? So I think that when you don't have these agencies involved, then things maybe run a bit more smoothly than when you have to designate periods and yeah. So I was wondering if, this is a horrible question, but maybe interesting. On the politics of representation, is there any way in which we can think of how this mapping exercise might disrupt the choreography of sharing in any way?
Yes, we've worried about that, of course, that there are lots of ways in which anytime you raise the profile of a space, you raise the stakes around its public identity. And so that certainly is the case in some ways. A lot of the sites that we've been doing work actually cultivate and seek out a more public expression that they see themselves as working against those narratives and those divisions and trying to combat this through the way in which there's a constant social and collective and media driven and social media driven representation of this place is a place where everybody gets along, or this is a place that is the case in Hania and that Karen and Manuel have worked on in particular is a great case of an almost infinitesimal Jewish community, really not even a million people to have at a synagogue, and creating a museum and a remembrance of Jewish community here. And so it actually is trying to take over that space. And so I think there's ways in which that is also part of the dynamic, is that this is part of there are cases where people are insisting on the disruptive quality of these spaces as having a public dimension. The wayside spaces that are less well known, that aren't in the media as already rendered as being part of it. So like my work in India is particularly challenging right now in terms of representing Muslim identity and Muslim spaces that are also attended by Hindus. And there are a lot of forces that are trying to disrupt that within the local politics. So for the people who are engaged with these sites, for whom these are meaningful, that's got to be paramount, is the question of like, what is this for this space in this community? Is this actually is bringing attention to it actually undermining potentials for collective life in and around the sites? And so that is certainly always, and that's where, you know, history might seem safer to say historically this place has been shared in a certain way, and try and not exposing a community to those potentialities. Yeah, so there's tensions around that in the work and in the sites that will feature. I think in particular, like the story map sites would be
Because there's a way in which these same evil journalistic forces that have been growing both of our disciplines can also find your website and say, this is a great article about the coming of the apocalypse.
Yes, one can never
Yeah, no, there's nothing, yeah.
correct for
Thank
those,
you.
those views. No, I mean, I really appreciate your question because it's something we grapple with quite a lot. I mean, even in doing the research and publishing it in books, you know,
No, of
and
course.
questions of anonymization, et cetera, are always present in relation to some of the sensitivities around the sites and the connotation and occupation of sites that, you know, Sophia is a good example there as well, right? For some, it's a gross misconduct that it's become a mosque. For others, it's the liberation. And
Yeah,
we like just telling the story allow for that. Oh yeah, Karen, sorry.
That's okay. I also wanted to highlight the fact that there is a tension with religious nationalist states that are uncomfortable with this sharing of sites. So in Turkey, what you see is now increasingly the priests who are uncomfortable with what's happening, whether should they, you know, how should they act with the Muslim visitors, what should in a sense, what should they do? But also, like in one of the cases, Aya Dimitrios, there is very much this concern that if it becomes well known, then it will be more public, and then the state will know about it, and then they might close it down. So we've already experienced a shrinking of the activities in this space as people have been working on it, as visitors, scholars have visited the space. And I think there's certainly a fear of the state here, and a kind of balancing act that is being decided on, given the role of the state, given where they are and how public they might become. They're worried about that.
Which in a way argues for having more knowledge of some of these
Yeah,
places as a rejection
Yes.
of the forced
Right, like a
separation.
record, yeah.
Yeah,
that makes
because
sense.
this is also not, and again, this is where the wider our net is, the better, in a sense, because it is simply an undeniable reality globally, that is almost never discussed, or it's discussed in a sort of utilitarian fashion to promote a particular either nationalist or so-called pluralist notion of tolerance or what have you, which all those sort of overly simplified frames are problematic. And so, yeah, more we have, the better.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. This was great. I'm just so happy to have gotten the chance to see more about the project. So I have questions that are related to Sarah and Trini's. The first one is with the mapping. I mean, I think Sarah articulated like why you want to have a map really well, right? Like you want to situate what you're doing in space, and the global map also gives you the opportunity to show sort of the extent of all of these different sites. Like you want to be able to sort of make that visual argument. I think the concern with the way that I saw you doing it there is that what Giovanna said about like the spaces that get left out, but also with the way you have religious, you know, the sort of kinds of devotion that are going on in these particular spaces disaggregated, it could make it look like some spaces are particularly pluralistic and tolerant and others are not. And I mean, I was looking in particular at the Arabian Peninsula and thinking about defining Mecca and Medina, for example, as a Muslim space, because Muslim is your column title, right? Not for, and I can see that you thought about this. And I think about that as, I think of Mecca as a quintessential sacred space and I mean, shared space in the way that you're describing it. Because for example, Sunnis and Shias pray there together, where otherwise they're articulated as being constantly, you know, in conflict. And so I'm wondering if perhaps there's a way to sort of show the breadth of the project without that disaggregation sort of hitting you in the face, and maybe have the searchability happen at the level of the text, right? Like you would still be able to pull out like which are the spaces where people are embodying Jewishness, for example, without having it be like that's the visual argument of the map, right? That here we have sharedness, or because I can say like you should, you know, you should represent, you know, religion at more sort of detailed levels, but that can of course become completely unwieldy. And so, yeah, I think it is a matter of like thinking about what you want to do with that. But I just also, I wonder if that kind of, you know, how useful that kind of disaggregation actually is at the level of like colored points on the map, right?
Yeah.
And then my other question, and then I'll stop, I promise, is just how you represent conflict. This conversation started making me think about that. And also when Karen was talking about the 1955 events at the church that you represented, because sharing means something different after those conflicts have occurred and after these identities have become politicized in different ways and in different historical moments. And I didn't see there being much of a shift, for example, pre-55 or post, in the way you're representing it in the story map. And I just wonder if that's something that you're talking about or would be useful.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to, I mean, we didn't have field work there from earlier periods, but so there's certainly that. And in any of the writings that we've done about this, those features are certainly accounted for. So the question is, what can we do within these kinds of, you know, kind of products that like a story map or like a global map? How much can we represent these shifting dynamics without turning any one of those instances into the
The thing.
sort of dominant narrative about it, right? So, this sort of would be ArcGIS sort of way of doing this, where you can do some more sophisticated search models that would search the text and find. And we could do keywords and have it tagged in a more sophisticated way than you can with the Google My Maps model. And so rather than saying whether we're looking at always situations of cooperative sharing or competitive sharing or antagonistic sharing or any of the other potential models, which we very swiftly threw out as being, you know, because it's constantly changing and it could be different tomorrow than it is today. So how are we, you know, do we have to go around and change the color of the pin or the, you know, with ArcGIS, you have to upload the whole data set every time in a new shapefile, every time you change anything about a site. So it's not like a Google My Map situation where you can actually do it, you know, more swiftly. So some part of this is the challenge of the technologies and what the amount of labor that would be involved and sustainability of something like that, you know, in anything beyond a snapshot in time. So we could say this is, you know, this is how things are in 2023, and we're not responsible for any changes that might occur in 2024 or July. But that's also unsatisfying. I don't know if you want to add anything to this, Karen.
I mean, I want to just say that we had serious discussions also about the historical, about, you know, what happened to these sites, their emergence and their transformation over time, and how could we put this into the story maps. And it became so complicated to give that temporal layer that we ended up deciding to do this kind of representation. But we do keep thinking about what is it that we can add, or where can we add the historical dimension? Where is it that telling a more capacious story is possible? And maybe over time we will find that. Also, I think we need to enlarge the set of cases so that we start with the variation, we start becoming more comfortable telling different stories. Right now, we're telling more or less one story. Once we start telling stories of contestation, Hagia Sophia, or things like that, this will become more complicated. And I'm hoping that then I'm really interested in giving a historical depth to this project. So maybe then we'll be able to start talking about what is it that we add, and at what layer, and in which way to give some historical, more than just those 3-4 dates that we have. How do we build that in? And there in those dates, if you see, we don't have change from one type of site to another. When we expand this, we'll have sites that were shared and then become not shared and then change again. So how are we going to do that? We are just learning to represent all of this. So I'm hoping that we will get more sophisticated as we work on this. I'm hopeful to be able to put more stuff on this, but at this stage, we don't know how to do it.
I mean, it would certainly be a dimension we could add with some of our ideas around having a little video.
Yes.
Sort of teaching tools as well, like I don't know if you know the website Khamsin, that does some nice little short, sort of often PowerPoint style narrated PowerPoints, instructing on where you can, even in 10-15 minutes, you could include a fair bit more nuance in those formats. And so embedding something like that into this, into the story maps and into the site in general would certainly be a way of bringing in additional dimensions, and see about building that with our, and even having multiple scholars on the same site who would have different perspectives that might not work the same. Having, one of the things we wanted to do is do sort of walkthrough videos now that we can travel again. So a lot of, like many of DH projects, it started in a pandemic. So a lot of this is working on, images and reports, and having colleagues and friends go to places that we haven't been able to go. And so that's another feature that we've considered adding, sort of like, just like brief, like iPhone videos, nothing too fancy, but hopefully nothing too herky jerky either that makes people nauseated. Some of those videos make me quite, so we want to avoid that. Anyway, if anybody's suggestions on doing that, I'd be delighted to hear camera stabilizing tips.
Thank you.
Oh, I can pick up there though. Your motion sickness kind of makes my idea not as good. But one of the projects that I used to manage a lab similar to this at another institution, and one of the projects that we funded was a Japanese professor who had a colleague in Japan. I think originally there was some plan for travel, like you were saying, but then the pandemic hit. But the idea was for the students in Japan who were in an English course to go around sites in Japan and talk about them, and then share those videos with the students in America in a Japanese course. But I think the compromise that we made, because they couldn't travel, was we lent them a 360 camera that they could walk around with. That really gives you a sense of scale and place, and you can also use those with like Google Cardboard, so you can get kind of like a virtual reality type experience. I think that is probably the most comprehensive way to get that type of scale and relatively cheap. Those are only a few $100s to do that, though. Yeah, the virtual reality type thing still has a lot of issues with motion sickness and things like that. So that's something you'd have to consider.
Yeah, and there are some really interesting, I mean, Mecca has some of these, and you can do this, and a lot of, iSophia has one, and where you can do a sort of virtual tour in that regard. And certainly we could link to things that are extant in that way. But it'd be great, and again, maybe this going back to Sarah's point about possibly doing this as a fieldwork project with student groups in some locations would be really interesting. It wouldn't expand our network as much if we would go back to Istanbul, but do some new sites. But maybe we'll come to Nairobi on your project.
If we
this
get
summer,
funded.
right? Is that this summer or next summer?
Next summer, if we get funded.
And the exhibits that you had were in New York.
One of them, well, yeah.
And I have two questions about the exhibits. One is, would you ever imagine an exhibit instead in one of these other places, and how different it would be? And what is the exhibit is interesting because it brings the people in place of the exhibit. But what is was the in terms of doing an exhibit, was that a format in studying which you found it easier to make decisions with I'm trying to figure out what would be different between what the digital does and what the in-person exhibit does, and what if that can tell you more about one or the other and what you would want.
Karen, do you want to, did you hear that?
Yes, I would like to, but I didn't really understand the question because it's very, I couldn't hear it. So if you want to tell me, Anna, what the question is, I will try to respond. It's very hard to hear everyone except you.
So the question is about whether some of the choices that were made in terms of curating the exhibit that were a little bit easier in some ways. I think even, what were the materials that were available?
Yes.
I don't.
Sure.
Yes, I guess, and maybe because
Well-
the exhibit is a more established genre.
Yeah.
and So you didn't, but I just, how different was the experience, and what if you can comment on that.
So, I mean, I think, so the different experience, I wasn't one of the curators, but I think Karen can talk a little bit about this, and just pointing out that each of the venues that were in that exhibit had a different sort of tone. So there were sort of historical materials at the public library and the Morgan Library, and then more photographs and objects and things that were brought together.
And contemporary art. Yeah. So what we did is in each location, we had exhibits in Marseille, Paris, Thessaloniki, and they had exhibits, the two of them in Morocco and Tunisia, and Ankara in Istanbul and Ankara. And what the way in which the exhibits were always organized was to mine into the history of the place where we were, to understand the coexistence and the kind of relationship between the different groups in that particular space, in that particular country, region, whatever, and then to do a historical part of this exhibit, which is from materials that are locally embedded. So we used, libraries, museums, all kinds of material from the place itself, and brought them together. And then we added to that photography and stories of the places where we worked. So there was always a contemporary section to the exhibit, which showed all these spaces and told their stories, showed the objects that they used in a kind of museum representation fashion. So that, I think, the ability to mix materials, to mix different media in a regular exhibit, and in many places there were actually a couple of museums or 3 spaces that collaborated. So it gave us also a lot of space to show the work that we do and to show the historical material, artistic mapping. For New York, for example, we had this incredible 15th century German map of Jerusalem that is on the cover of our catalog, that was at the public library, and we showed that, so I think there we were able to tell a story maybe in a more layered fashion. This is, when you go online, it's just more or less one thing more. It's a little more simplified.